Alright, so I want to show you the shelter that we're working on. I'm calling it the Hobo Wig-WHAM because it's not quite a wigwam. It's inspired by Indian architecture, but we're kind of improvising. We're doing our own thing, so we're just taking it from there. I don't want to call it a wigwam because, you know, then people see this and they think this is like a traditional wigwam, which it is not. Let's see, how did we get started? We needed to determine how big we wanted this shelter first. So I kind of like dug out some leaves about the size we thought we might want in a fire pit. And then Teresa stood in the middle. Well, we laid down on both sides of the fire pit and figured out like how big it needs to be for both of us to fit in to lay down beside the fire safely, not too close. And then making little marks there that would make room for the bed. Teresa stood where the fire pit would be. We broke off a stick and I held it to my hip and she held it to her solar plexus. And I walked around and drew a circle, you know, which was a pretty nice circle. And then it was time to make holes. Now for a wigwam, you don't want to just connect the pole to the opposite pole, because what you wind up with is something that looks like an asterisk at the top. You don't have a smoke hole. So when you have a pole, I start off with 8 poles, and I grabbed a stick, and it already had a little bit of a point on it. I just helped it along a little bit. Found another stick that made a pretty good hammer, and I just picked a place and pounded into the ground and made a hole. I spent more time making a deeper hole than what I just showed you. And then I looked straight across from the hole, where I'm imagining myself going straight through the fire pit, and made a hole straight across. Then I eyeballed like where halfway would be, and did it again. Made my hole, straight across, made a hole. And then I imagined halfway between those, so I ended up with 8 holes, as evenly spaced as I could. Then I collected some saplings. I was looking for, you know, it was kind of guesswork of what size. And red cedar saplings are best. They're rot resistant, but I just used what I had. We don't have a whole lot of red cedar around here the right size. So we've got beech, we've got American hop hornbeam, we've got ironwood, red maple, oak, I feel like a few others, sweet gum. So we're just experimenting. I don't know how this is going to do, but we're going to find out. And I've done these structures before, twice before, to practice thatching, but this is the biggest one I've ever done, where I kind of do a wigwam structure. It's the covering of it that always has been the challenge for me. So when I stick my 8 poles in, these were 2 of the original 8. I bend it over, and this took a lot of help from Teresa. It was too much to try to show you that because there's only 2 of us. But I bend it over and tie it to the other sapling, overlapping. So hopefully you can see that as we're walking around talking about other things. But they overlapped, and trying to get the right size was really challenging. It was a lot of troubleshooting. And then I did the same thing here. So instead of crossing, going straight across, there were 2 parallel arches. And then I did that the other side, 2 parallel arches. So I wound up with a big smoke hole up there, way too big. So then I came back and pounded some more holes in the ground and got more saplings and made this the size of what I wanted my smoke hole. So then I've got 2 more arches and 2 more arches coming up this way. And now I've closed in my smoke hole. We'll see that in a minute when we go inside. Even with the hole in the ground, the first time I tried to do this, I thought I'd just sit it on top of the ground. Doesn't work. It needs some kind of leverage, some security. So I'd stick the sapling in the hole in the ground, and it would pop out. So I needed to take some stakes and pound them in really hard. And then I took this twine, and our whole thing we're doing here, our kind of rule is we're not spending money. So this is sort of, if society collapses, a mixture of natural materials and scavenged materials. So the cord that I'm using is plastic baling twine from landscaping that we find along the road. So I tie the sapling to that, and even though the sapling wasn't that deep in the ground, the stake it's tied to is quite a bit deeper. So that gave it some security. The knots I would use when I have 2 saplings to tie together, like you can see this is the base of one, followed continuing from the end of another. I would make a overhand knot, which is something like this. Something like that. Overhand knot. And that way, I could pull it through itself and pull it tight, 2 wraps, and then 2 half hitches to finish it off. I show those knots a lot better with more detail in our video Hobo Hammocks Part 1. So if you're not familiar with overhand knots and half hitches, look at that video. It's shown a lot better. And then when I have 2 that are crossing, not side by side, I start off with my overhand knot and go diagonal to hold them both together. And then from there, do 2 wraps. So I wrap around, under, over, under, over, under, over. And it's kind of an 8 shape. And then 1 frap to cinch it together. So the frap goes between the 2. And then I end it with 2 overhand knots. If you're not familiar with wrapping and frapping, check out, I don't know, maybe a Boy Scout guide or something like that. That's where I learned wrapping and frapping. And it's a really good way to join this kind. This is where knots really come in handy. I took the bark off because I've heard that's best. I'm not sure. This is an experiment. I've heard it kind of seasons it and dries out better, that it discourages rot. But maybe if I do another shelter, I'll keep the bark on and see if I notice a difference. But that's why all the bark is skinned. And that was one of the more time-consuming parts of this, skinning all the bark off. And just as long as we got the outer bark off, there's a mixture of down to the wood and cambium layer here. But just removing the outer bark. So if you follow me, Teresa. Oh, and the clothes I have hanging here, since we're still working on it, we're on our way to the river. We live in our van, so we're kind of doing a hobo thing. And every day we go to the river and do whatever bathing, clothes washing we're going to do. So we always bring our clothes with us. And I hang my clothes here just until we get down there. We put in an hour's worth of work a day and then go down to the river. It's part of our daily routine when we're out in this part of the country. Now to make the door, here are 2 of the original stakes. I said I added 2 more rows to close in the smoke hole, which I'll show you in more detail in a minute. But I wanted the door just big enough. Like, that's one of the rules of shelter. You don't want a huge door because it's just all the heat escapes. Just big enough. So I added this sapling and just kind of tied it in with everything else to close in the door. So it's this wide. And then for my rows from then on out, I tie them to the side, so that made our door. Now here are the 2 rows I added. Remember that I started with an original 8, which left a huge hole. I added these 2, and I added these 2. And that left me with a smoke hole that I hope is more the size I'm looking for. Only experience is gonna determine that. Often with primitive shelters, ventilation and smoke is one of the trickier parts to troubleshoot. So we're hoping this is just the right amount that doesn't let too much rain in and lets enough smoke out. And if the hole's small enough, even if it does rain and you've got a nice fire going, it'll evaporate in the fire. It won't put out your fire because this is really protected. Rain often doesn't fall straight down. It kind of comes in at an angle, so not too much is here. And we might kind of figure out some kind of flap or something to add up here. Is there anything else, Teresa, while we're in here? Here's the cords that we just have prefabbed with a lot of them have the overhand knot in them. Just ready to go as we continue. And I think the last thing I have to show is shingling. Am I forgetting anything?
I mean, like I have shown this photos of our structure, and people have really remarked like how big it is in here.
Yeah, we wanted something roomy enough where it would feel like a home, but not excessive, because every bit of space you don't need is space you have to heat. So we wanted something cozy, and that's what we're hoping we have. We live in a van, and that's a nice shelter, but if we can get this right, we're gonna have a fire in here, we're out in the woods, it's gonna be another level of like belonging on the land and being cozy, plus practicing a skill that could really come in handy when the gas runs out and, living in a van is not a good option anymore. And I wanted to show the shelter at this stage, a part 1 before we finish, because from here on out, we're covering up the shelter. Now, this is always the part I've had the challenge with. I've tried thatching with broom sedge, which worked pretty well, but broom sedge, the stuff I used was already dead, so it would wear out pretty quick, and it was a lot of work. What we're going to try now is shingling. And again, like I said, we're not trying to be traditionalists here. This is a living shelter for a practical, like nowadays, not pretending like it's 200 years ago. We're doing a hobo shelter, like what can we use now with no money, finding around the landscape. And the fact is that most modern landscapes have plenty of litter, so we're going to use it. Our shingles are right now a mixture of plywood, whatever this is, whatever we can find that looks like it might work. We might try some bark, but it's winter time, and I've tried to collect bark in the winter before and didn't have any luck, but I might try it again. Maybe it was part of my technique. But the way I shingle is I have one underneath and then two on top. So I try to stagger these. If I had them side by side, they would leave big gaps down here. But if I stagger them, the gaps are closed in. I'm going to try a technique that I've heard works, that I don't need to tie down the first layer of shingles, because the layer of shingles over it supposedly will hold it down. We'll see how it works. But the next layer of shingles will have to be tied, depending on how big they are, to one of these rows. And if they don't fit quite right, if I find a lot of good shingles that are different size, we may have to cut more saplings and add another row. But we'll see what we have to work with. But those shingles will have to overlap all the gaps. They can be long, but they can't be too short. And I will also stagger those underneath, over, underneath, over. And yeah, so this is an experiment. I look at this as more of here's what we're trying, more than a how-to video. If this works out and turns into something really awesome, maybe then we can call it a how-to video. But right now, this is a let's explore this and see what happens kind of video. Another option, if we get all the shingles on and we find, sometimes we find big discarded tarps or pieces of plastic, we can wrap the outside in that for added insulation and rain protection. We can also possibly find blankets or make grass mats, which I know how to do, and add insulation to the inside of the Wig-WHAM. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're going for. Thought I had something else. We have a little fire pit on the outside, on the other side of the shelter, so we're going to have an outside fire pit and then come in here for the night. Looked like you had something to say?
Oh, I was just going to reiterate the asymmetrical nature of this, and just once again, point out that there's a lot of bends and twists and things that you don't necessarily plan for when you're collecting saplings from the woods instead of going to some sort of lumber yard or something. So there's this one specific angle, you can tell it kind of looks like the Wig-WHAM's being blown from the southwest. But I like it. I think it gives it character, and I'm just really excited to see as we start to fill in the shingles just how this is going to work.
Yeah, we're really excited to see how this comes together. One more thing about the door is I'm very conscious of which direction it faces. That door is facing east, southeast, that direction, because when we have storms, bad weather, we're in North Carolina, they tend to blow in from the west. And when we have cold wind, that tends to come in from the north. So facing it in that direction will be the first sunshine when it's cold, and also the gentlest wind we're bound to have. So it's really good to have your door facing in that direction. And another technique, we're not planning on doing this right now, but depending on how things go, we might change our minds, is to put more saplings on the outside and have another 8 that cover the whole thing, that hold it together. Right now, I'm not thinking we need to do that, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. If it seems kind of like, like a heavy wind might give it problems, cover it with an exoskeleton of saplings. Really tight, pull it down. And again, like we can't show you everything we had to go through to tie these together, but there was a lot of troubleshooting, and it's really hard to get them matching in size. So just know that that's going to be a challenge. But if you start practicing, don't get discouraged, because you're going to learn a lot in the practicing, and every shelter you build from that point on, you probably won't make all the same mistakes over and over. So get out there and do it.
Yeah, just get started.
Yeah. Thanks.